Welcome to Silent Secrets. I'm your host for tonight's mystery. Today's tale begins with a quiet moment, a simple knock, a forgotten letter, and a truth that was never meant to be discovered. But one hidden secret, buried in the shadows, will turn an ordinary day into a night no one will ever forget. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Silent Secrets and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We love seeing how far these mysteries travel. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's uncover tonight's silent secret. Chapter 1. Fay Winter at Briarstone Hall. The car turned slowly off the main road and onto the long tree-lined drive of Briarstone Hall. Snow lay deep upon the ground, turning the world into a landscape of white and shadow. Lanterns had been set at intervals along the avenue, their golden light glowing through the drifting flakes and reflecting off the frosted branches overhead. Captain Hastings, his nose almost pressed to the window, gave a low whistle of appreciation. "Now this," he said, "is what I call a proper English Christmas. Look at those trees, Poirot, and the house. Good heavens." The house revealed itself gradually, as though conscious of its own grandeur. Briarstone Hall was a rambling, many-windowed structure of mellow stone, the central facade rising to a pediment supported by tall columns. Tonight its windows blazed with light, wreaths hung from the iron gates, a huge fir tree could be glimpsed through one of the upper windows, and the faint strains of music drifted across the cold air. Poirot sat back against the leather seat, his gloved hands lightly clasped around the handle of his cane. "It is beautiful," he agreed. "And yet, my friend, beauty does not always mean peace." Hastings laughed. "You and your suspicions, it is a charity gala. That is all. A fine house, a generous hostess, a good cause. What could be more innocent?" Poirot's eyes moved toward the great house once more. "We shall see." The car came to a halt before the wide stone steps. A liveried footman opened the door, and the blast of warmth from inside the hall was almost startling after the sting of the winter air. Hastings stepped out first, pulling his coat tight, while Poirot emerged with the unhurried precision that seemed to govern his every movement. The entrance hall of Briarstone Hall was a picture of festive opulence. Garlands of evergreen and holly, threaded with red ribbons, were draped along the sweeping staircase. The polished marble floor reflected the light of crystal chandeliers. A great arrangement of white lilies and winter roses stood upon a table near the door, their scent delicate and cool. At the far end of the hall, beneath an archway leading toward the ballroom, stood Margaret Whitfield. Their hostess was a woman in her late 50s perhaps, with silver threaded elegantly through her dark hair, which she wore swept back in a simple style that suited her thoughtful face. Her gown was of deep green velvet, and she wore a small brooch in the shape of a star at her throat. Everything about her suggested warmth, welcome, and quiet capability. Yet Poirot, as he approached, noted the faint tension in her posture, the too quick rise and fall of her breath. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, extending both hands in greeting. "I cannot tell you how delighted I am that you accepted my invitation." "You are too kind," Poirot replied with a slight bow. "We are honored to be your guests, Mrs. Whitfield." "Miss Whitfield," she corrected gently, with a small smile. "I never married, but you must call me Margaret. Everybody does." There was something appealing in the way she said it, a quiet insistence on informality that did not quite reach her eyes. "This gala of yours," Hastings said. "It looks to be a splendid affair." "I hope so," Margaret answered. "The Briarstone Children's Fund depends heavily on this evening's generosity. We have guests from London, from the local town, and even a minor celebrity or two." She laughed lightly, though Poirot heard the strain beneath it. "Please, go through. Supper will be served later, but for now the musicians are doing their best to keep everyone lively." As they passed beneath the archway, Poirot said in a low voice, "A woman of warmth and courage, I think." "She seemed charming," Hastings agreed, and, Poirot added softly, "very much afraid of something." The ballroom of Briarstone Hall was a long, high-ceilinged room, with tall windows on one side and a row of mirrors on the other. Tonight, Each window was framed by dark red drapes, and each mirror reflected the flicker of candlelight. A great crystal chandelier hung from the center of the ceiling, its faceted drops scattering points of light across the guests as they moved. At one end of the room, a string quartet played a cheerful waltz at the other. Near a refreshment table laden with punch and crystal glasses stood a large mistletoe arch. Guests stepped beneath it with laughter and mock ceremony, exchanging chaste kisses on the cheek, festive greetings or exaggerated bows. Hastings's eyes brightened at the sight. "Now that," he said, "is a charming idea." Poirot smiled. "It is also, perhaps, a place where many people come and go, where one may observe who greets whom, and who avoids whom." They had scarcely crossed the threshold before a voice greeted them. "Mr. Poirot, I presume. I recognized you from the papers." A tall man in an impeccably tailored evening suit approached, holding a glass of champagne. He had strong, sharp features, dark hair brushed back from his forehead, and eyes that did not entirely match the smooth confidence of his smile. "Victor Hale," he said, offering his hand. "Whitfield and Hale Investments. My firm works with Margaret on some of the charities accounts." Poirot shook his hand. "A pleasure, Mr. Hale." Hale's grip was firm, perhaps a fraction too firm. "I must say, I didn't expect a detective to be among the guests. Are we all to feel nervous?" "Not at all," Poirot replied. "I am here only as a friend of Miss Whitfield." "Even so," Hale said, his tone light, but his gaze assessing, "your presence might keep everyone honest." "Not that we have anything to hide, eh?" Hastings thought the remark was jovial. Poirot regarded Hale for a moment longer. There was something in the man's eyes, a flicker of calculation, a habit of measuring every person and opportunity. "Honesty," Poirot said mildly, "is most becoming at Christmas, Mr. Hale." Hale laughed and turned away as another guest called his name, though Poirot noticed how he checked his watch with an air of distraction. "Successful fellow, no doubt," Hastings murmured. "But a touch over-assured, perhaps." "Perhaps," Poirot agreed. Near the mistletoe arch stood a woman with auburn hair cut in a neat bob, wearing a dress of dark blue that set off her clear grey eyes. She was not beautiful in the dramatic sense, but she had the sort of face that drew attention, alert, intelligent, with a hint of amusement as she observed the crowd. A small notebook was tucked into the clasp of her handbag as Poirot and Hastings passed. She smiled. "You must be Hercule Poirot. I wondered if the rumors were true." Miss Poirot prompted. "Caroline Brooks," she said. "I write for the London Courier. Our paper has been covering the Briarstone Gala for years. I asked Margaret if I might attend again this year for a human interest piece." Hastings looked interested. "You write about charitable events?" "And the people behind them," she replied. "This house has quite a history, you know. Family legacies always make for good copy. People like to read about grand halls and old names, and about how philanthropy redeems them." "Redeems them," Poirot repeated. She tilted her head. "Money and power are rarely innocent, but Margaret uses her inheritance for good. That makes her very readable." Her tone was lightly teasing, but Poirot noticed that her attention, even as she spoke to them, kept flicking toward a figure near one of the windows, a man standing somewhat apart from the main throng, half in the shadow of a tall plant. He was of medium height, slightly stooped about the shoulders, with fair hair that had begun to thin. His evening clothes were well made but not new, and there was a certain stiffness about the way he held himself, as though he were not accustomed to such scenes. His gaze moved restlessly over the guests, but never lingered on any one group for long. "Is that—" Hastings began. "Yes," Caroline said quietly. "Daniel Whitfield." Margaret's brother, the word estranged, drifted back into Poirot's memory from the letter that had invited him to Briarstone Hall. Margaret had mentioned him almost in passing, with a single line that had felt oddly heavy. Daniel Whitfield turned slightly, and for a moment his features were fully visible. There was something anxious there, something bruised. He kept one hand wrapped around a glass he did not drink from. Brother and sister at the same party, yet standing on opposite sides of the room, Poirot observed. Caroline gave a small, knowing smile. you noticed. Not quite the image of holiday harmony the charity pamphlet would like to suggest. Is it? Do you know the cause of the distance between them? Poirot asked. Caroline considered. Then shrugged. I know rumors, but I prefer facts, Mr. Poirot. I was rather hoping you might unintentionally help me collect some. Her gaze was direct, unafraid. She was clearly a woman used to asking questions that made others uncomfortable. Poirot smiled. I am but a humble guest tonight. If I discover anything, it will not be for publication. Caroline's lips quirked. We shall see. She moved away, notebook already in hand. Hastings shook his head. Journalists always hunting a story. Stories are often there to be found, Poirot replied, especially where people say there is nothing to tell. The music changed, shifting to a slower waltz. Couples moved onto the dance floor. Light glinted off jewelry and crystal. A servant passed by bearing a tray of canapés. The scent of roasted chestnuts mingled with pine and perfume, yet beneath the glitter, something subtle tugged at Poirot's attention. Margaret Whitfield, though she smiled and greeted her guests, cast frequent glances toward her brother Daniel, in turn kept his distance. His eyes filled with hesitation whenever they came close to meeting her gaze. Victor Hale moved smoothly through the crowd, pausing to exchange a few words with Caroline, then drawing Daniel aside for a brief, low-voiced conversation that ended with Daniel looking even more taut. Caroline wrote something quickly in her notebook afterward, her expression thoughtful. Near the mistletoe arch, two guests laughed too loudly. Another couple passed beneath it without touching, their faces tight, their eyes hard. Poirot watched all of this from a quiet vantage point near one of the mirrors. Hastings, beside him, seemed wholly absorbed in the music and the general sense of occasion. Well, Poirot, Hastings said after a moment, you must admit it is all quite harmless so far. Perhaps you are misjudging the mood. Poirot shook his head very slightly. My friend, he said, there are many kinds of tension. There is the tension of anger which blazes and is easily seen. There is the tension of fear, which makes the hands tremble. And then there is this. He gestured with his chin toward the scattered tableau of guests, the subtle lines of avoidance and unease, the tension that hides itself in glances, in the silences between words. That is the kind which worries me most. Hastings frowned. Do you think something is wrong? Poirot's eyes came to rest once more on Daniel Whitfield, who had turned away from Victor Hale and now stood alone, staring at the snow beyond the window. I think, Poirot said quietly, that this is not simply a Christmas gala at a fine country house. It is also a stage on which old grievances are waiting in the wings, and when such grievances step forward, they do not always bring gifts. As the orchestra played and the mistletoe hung above the laughing guests, Briarstone Hall seemed, to the casual eye, the picture of festive cheer. But to Hercule Poirot, the light was already edged with shadow, and he knew, without yet knowing why, that the night ahead would bring more than charity and goodwill. Chapter 2 for a kiss and a scream. The evening at Briarstone Hall had reached its warmest point, at least in appearance. The orchestra shifted into a soft, lilting melody, the kind that invited couples to drift toward the mistletoe arch with gentle laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The clock above the ballroom doors crept toward 10, and servants moved gracefully through the crowd with silver trays of mulled wine. Margaret Whitfield stepped forward to begin the traditional holiday toast. Her face composed, despite the tension Poirot had sensed earlier. Guests gathered in a semicircle beneath the arch, its hanging mistletoe clusters glimmering in the candlelight, like pale, watchful eyes. Hastings nudged Poirot lightly. Now this is charming, Poirot. Not a hint of trouble after all. Poirot offered a small, thoughtful smile. My friend, if trouble wore bells and ribbons, even you would spot it. But alas, it dresses much more subtly. Hastings frowned at this remark, but before he could respond, Margaret lifted her glass. My dear friends, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, thank you for joining us tonight in support of the Briarstone Children's Fund. Your generosity, But the rest of her words were drowned by a sudden, piercing scream. It came from near the mistletoe arch, sharp enough to slice cleanly through the music and chatter. Guests turned as one. A woman stumbled backward, clutching her throat. And there, beside her, Victor Hale swayed violently, his face draining of color. "Hale," someone gasped. "Victor, what's wrong?" The businessman's hand, still holding a wineglass, trembled. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the polished floor with a crystalline crash. Then Victor Hale collapsed. Pandemonium erupted instantly. Several guests cried out. Someone fainted. Margaret Whitfield dropped her glass entirely, her face going white. Caroline Brooks pushed through the crowd. Notebook forgotten, shock overtaking her sharp composure. Daniel Whitfield stood frozen near the window, a look of horror flitting across his features. Poirot, however, moved with decisive calm. "Stand back, if you please. Make space. Hastings, clear a circle." Hastings obeyed at once, coaxing the stunned guests aside. Poirot knelt beside the fallen man, his sharp gaze absorbing every detail. Hale lay sprawled on his side, breath shallow, lips tinged with a faint bluish hue. His eyes fluttered closed. But Poirot's attention went not first to the man's expression, nor to the wine he had consumed. It went to a glint of metal near Victor Hale's collar, a silver tipped dart, thin, elegant, nearly invisible against the dark fabric of his suit, rested just beneath the left shoulder. Poirot leaned closer, careful not to touch it. "How extraordinary," he murmured. The dart was small enough to be mistaken for a stray ornament pin. Only Poirot, with his meticulous habit of noting what others dismissed, saw its significance at once. And then he caught the smell, faint, bitter, a chemical edge that rose from the tiny wound like a ghost of death poison. "Hastings," Poirot said quietly, "do not allow anyone to disturb this dart. It is the instrument of the attack." "Attack?" Hastings echoed, astonished. "You mean—" "Yes," Poirot said softly. "It is no accident. Victor Hale has been struck deliberately." Inspector Reed, who had been at the far side of the room speaking with the local magistrate, now strode toward them, pushing through the cluster of frightened guests. "What's happened here?" he demanded. "Is he—" "A dart, Inspector," Poirot said, indicating the weapon with a slight gesture. "And on it, a poison powerful, fast." Reed crouched beside Poirot, swearing under his breath. "How on earth? No one fired anything. I heard no gunshot." "It was not fired from a gun." Poirot pointed subtly upward. "There, above the arch." Reed followed Poirot's gaze. A decorative garland draped above the mistletoe was shifting slightly, more than the air current should permit. Poirot continued. A small blowpipe could be concealed among the greenery, a well-placed angle, a crowd distracted by the toast, a single breath, and the deed is done. The inspector's expression hardened. "So we have a murderer standing among us." Poirot nodded once. Indeed, a murderer who is very calm at this moment, for they knew precisely what effect their little dart would have. Victor Hale let out a faint groan, but his eyes did not open. Poirot placed 2 fingers carefully on the man's wrist. "The pulse fades," he said quietly. Margaret Whitfield, standing nearby, pressed a hand to her mouth. "Dear heaven, Victor, is he dying?" Poirot looked up at her. His expression was grave, but steady. "I fear, Miss Whitfield, that unless a miracle arrives, Monsieur Hale has very little time." A murmur spread like wildfire. Poison? A dart? My God, who would do such a thing? Under the mistletoe, how grotesque. Daniel Whitfield, who had lingered at the edge of the circle, now stepped forward with visible difficulty. "Victor, we spoke earlier. I don't understand." Caroline Brooks moved closer as well, her journalistic instincts struggling against her shock. "Poirot," she asked breathlessly, "can you tell who might have done this?" "No," Poirot replied. Not yet. He looked around the room with a sweep of his keen eyes. But the answer is here in this ballroom among these guests. Hastings glanced upward nervously. If someone used a blowpipe, Poirot, they must have been very close. Yes, Poirot said softly, and they hid their intentions well. A blowpipe requires proximity and courage, or desperation. He stood slowly. Hastings, alert the household staff. Ask for doors to be secured. No one leaves until the police take control. Inspector Reed nodded, sharply agreed. We treat this as a homicide until proven otherwise. Margaret swayed slightly. Poirot caught her arm gently. Sit, Miss Whitfield. This is a terrible shock, but you must remain calm. She nodded, though her face was pale as the snow outside. Who would harm Victor? The gala, it was meant to do good. Why would anyone? Poirot's voice was gentle. Because, Miss Whitfield, even in the midst of celebration, old resentments linger. Hidden tensions grow, and under the cover of a toast, a murderer found their opportunity. He looked down once more at Victor Hale, then at the dart glinting faintly against the man's collar. The weapon tells us one thing very clearly, Poirot whispered, more to himself than to the room. This was no moment of passion. It was planned. As the guests trembled, and the music died into silence, Briarstone Hall, so filled with light and festivity moments before, shifted into the first shadow of a mystery. And Hercule Poirot, even as he knelt beside the dying man, knew the next hours would reveal secrets as sharp and deadly as the silver-tipped dart beneath the mistletoe arch. Chapter 3. A weapon in plain sight. Briarstone Hall. Moments earlier, a vision of festive splendor now resembled a stage suspended in dread. Guests clustered together in uneasy knots, exchanging frightened whispers beneath twinkling lights that seemed suddenly garish, mocking. The music had stopped. Servants hovered uncertainly at the edges of the ballroom, unsure whether to move or freeze. Inspector Reed arrived within minutes, summoned from the nearby town and ushered through back corridors to avoid the panicked crowd at the entrance. Reed was a tall, square-built man with a voice that carried authority and a face set in lines of perpetual skepticism. His arrival brought a semblance of order, though not comfort. "Everyone remains where they are," Reed commanded, signaling 2 constables to close the great double doors. "No one leaves this room unless cleared by Mr. Poirot or myself." Margaret Whitfield stood near the hearth, supported by Caroline Brooks, who, though shaken, watched everything with the eyes of a born observer. Daniel Whitfield hovered nearby, pale and haunted. The other guests murmured anxiously as Reed strode toward Poirot, who still knelt near the mistletoe arch. "What do we have, Poirot?" Reed asked grimly. Poirot rose, dusting his knees. "A mechanism of surprising cleverness, Inspector. A contrivance designed to conceal a weapon in plain sight." He gestured toward the arch, where a garland of evergreen and red ribbon draped over a curved wooden frame. At a glance it appeared perfectly ordinary. But Poirot had already noted a subtle irregularity in its shape. "With your permission," Poirot said, "I will demonstrate." Reed nodded. Poirot stepped onto a nearby chair, steadying himself with remarkable grace for a man of his compact build. He lifted a section of the garland with delicate fingers, revealing a narrow beam beneath, hollowed out along its length. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Inside the hollow was a tiny metal tube, barely the width of a pencil, positioned at an angle toward the floor where Victor Hale had stood. A thin brass spring and a small latch formed a crude but effective firing mechanism. As Poirot tested the frame with a careful hand, the arch gave a faint, almost imperceptible shift on its supports, as though it were minutely counterbalanced. It was the sort of instability no guest would notice in passing conversation, but a mechanic or a murderer might find very useful indeed. "Good heavens," Hastings murmured, "a trap set above the mistletoe." "Exactly," Poirot said. "Our murderer is one who prefers subtlety to spectacle. The dart was not blown from a pipe. Inspector, it was fired by this device. Inspector Reed leaned closer. A mechanical release. Triggered how? Poirot gestured toward a length of thread that dangled uselessly from the underside of the arch. It was broken, the ends frayed. This string, Poirot explained, ran through the garland and could be pulled discreetly from ground level. When pulled, it snapped the latch, firing the dart. Reed frowned. So the killer planned it all in advance, but triggered it manually the moment Hale stood beneath the arch. Poirot nodded. And then, after firing, the string was quickly torn away, perhaps to prevent it from hanging obviously at the killer's side. The inspector's eyes hardened, meaning the murderer was standing close, very close. Poirot stepped off the chair with careful poise. Within arm's reach, certainly, but let us look further. He crouched near the base of the arch where Hale had collapsed and examined the polished floorboards. His gaze sharpened at a faint speck of green. "Aha," Poirot murmured. He lifted a small sprig of crushed mistletoe from the floor. Its white berries had burst, leaving tiny droplets of milky sap. Hastings leaned in. "What does that tell us, Poirot?" "It tells us," Poirot replied, "that someone interfered with this arch earlier. The mistletoe is not merely decoration. It conceals the hollow beam and the mechanism in adjusting the device. The killer crushed this sprig." Inspector Reed took the sprig in gloved fingers. So the trap was tampered with before the toast, meaning the murderer had ample time to prepare. "Indeed," Poirot said. "And consider, Inspector, the mistletoe arch is the centerpiece of the ballroom. It attracts attention, but its decorations also provide perfect camouflage for a hidden device." Reed studied the assembly of guests, his stern gaze sweeping from one face to another. "Who would have access to this arch earlier today? Staff, guests, perhaps both," Poirot replied. "Yet access alone does not suffice. One must also know that Hale would pass beneath it, and at precisely what moment." Caroline Brooks spoke up from near Margaret. "Victor passed beneath it several times tonight. He was greeting donors, journalists, anyone who wished to exchange a holiday kiss." Poirot inclined his head. "Just so, but only one moment was chosen. One moment planned. The murderer waited until Hale was centered beneath the arch, until Margaret raised her glass for the toast, creating a natural distraction." Daniel Whitfield shifted uncomfortably. It could have been anyone standing near him. Poirot looked at Daniel, long and thoughtfully. "Yes, anyone. Which is why we must be very careful, Mr. Whitfield, not to overlook the details." Hastings noticed Daniel's face pale slightly at the remark. Poirot turned back to Reed. "Inspector, let us consider the broken trigger string. A break of this sort suggests it was pulled sharply. Too sharply, perhaps in haste or fear. That tells us something of the killer's state of mind." Reed grunted. "So not a cool, calculating assassin." Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. "All murderers believe they are calm until the moment of action." He stepped back, addressing the group. "We know this much. The weapon was concealed in the arch. It required preparation earlier in the evening. It was triggered manually. The dart was poisoned with a fast-acting substance, and Hale was deliberately targeted, not a random victim." Margaret Whitfield clutched the arm of a chair for support. "But why Victor? He was such a supporter of the charity. He worked tirelessly." Poirot's gaze shifted toward her, gentle but probing. "Perhaps, Miss Whitfield, he worked tirelessly in ways not everyone welcomed." She looked away. Inspector Reed straightened. "Poirot, you found the mechanism. You saw the dart. What do you deduce of the killer?" Poirot folded his hands behind his back. "That they are one of us," he said softly, "here in this very room, and they prepared for this moment with great care." Murmurs rose anxiously among the guests. Poirot raised one hand for silence. "And one more thing. Whoever set this trap knew the arch intimately. They must have examined it closely in advance. I suggest, Inspector, that we begin with those who were seen near it earlier in the evening." Reed nodded grimly. "We start interviews at once." As constables moved through the ballroom, Poirot looked once more at the crushed mistletoe in Reed's hand. A symbol of affection, he murmured. Used tonight to conceal betrayal. How curious, Hastings. How often crime wears a festive disguise. And Hastings, watching the anxious faces around them, could not help but agree that within the glitter, the garlands, and the warm glow of Briarstone Hall, something cold and calculating had moved unseen, until the moment a silver dart struck and shattered the illusion of peace. Chapter 4 Fey motives wrapped in ribbon. The ballroom of Briarstone Hall had taken on a different character now, no longer the scene of holiday cheer, but a chamber thick with tension and whispered accusations. The constables kept the doors sealed, while Inspector Reed began moving through the guests, taking statements. Poirot, however, preferred to let the truth come to him. He positioned himself near a long table draped with crimson cloth, his eyes ever alert as people drifted forward, one by one, compelled by guilt, fear, or the simple need to unburden themselves. Hastings lingered nearby, quietly observing. It feels rather like the aftermath of a storm, Poirot. The decorations are still up, but everything else seems overturned. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Yes, my friend, the gaiety collapses, and beneath it lie the motives, scattered like ornaments from a fallen tree. He had hardly finished speaking when Margaret Whitfield approached, clutching a handkerchief that she twisted repeatedly between her fingers. Her complexion was pale, her posture rigid, as if she had forced herself into calmness by sheer will. Mr. Poirot, she said softly, I think I must tell you something about Victor. Poirot inclined his head. Anything you can share, Miss Whitfield, may help us understand what happened. Margaret took a breath, steady yet trembling. He threatened me. Only this morning. Hastings blinked. Threatened you, but he was one of the charity's largest supporters. Margaret gave a brittle smile. Yes, and he used that support as leverage. Victor told me he would withdraw his funding from the Briarstone Children's Fund unless I agreed to sell part of our estate, the Western Woodland, to be exact. Poirot's brows lifted. That land belongs to your family for generations. No. Yes, she whispered, and selling it would destroy the trust my parents wished me to uphold. But Victor insisted. He said it was an underdeveloped investment waiting to be claimed. When I refused, he warned me I would regret obstructing him. Poirot asked gently, Did you tell anyone of this conversation? I thought it was merely business pressure. Victor could be forceful, but I never imagined. She trailed off, swallowing hard. I didn't want to believe he meant harm. Poirot nodded, storing her confession like a fragile ornament among many. You did well to tell me, Miss Whitfield. As Margaret stepped aside, Caroline Brooks approached. She carried her notebook pressed tightly against her side, as though it offered some form of armor. Her usual composure was sharpened, not dulled by the shock of the evening. Poirot, she said with a sigh, I suppose it's my turn. You have information? Poirot asked. Caroline's lips curved in a wry, humorless smile. Victor Hale and I had history. Hastings raised an eyebrow. You dated him? No, she laughed bitterly. Far from it, I exposed him. Poirot nodded slowly. Ah, your work at the Courier. Yes, 2 years ago, I investigated one of Hale's development projects. He had cut corners, endangered workers, and falsified reports. I published the truth. He despised me for it. Hastings exclaimed, But surely he couldn't blame you for doing your job. Oh, he blamed me very effectively, Caroline replied. He tried to sue. He tried to discredit me publicly. He failed, but the resentment remained whenever we were in the same room. He made sure I felt it. Poirot studied her carefully. And did you resent him in return? Caroline hesitated. I resented that he believed himself above consequence, and I resented the harm he caused others, but hate. Number Victor Hale was not worth my hatred. Poirot inclined his head. Still, it is a motive. Perhaps, she admitted, but a motive does not make a murderer. As Caroline stepped away, Daniel Whitfield approached. reluctantly, as though every step required a battle with himself. His eyes had grown more troubled with each passing minute, and now he looked on the verge of collapse. "Is it true," he whispered, "that the dart was meant only for Victor, that this wasn't some misfire?" Poirot regarded him with steady calm. "It was no accident, Mr. Whitfield. The mechanism was aimed with great precision." Daniel moved a shaking hand through his fair hair. "Then I must speak. I can no longer pretend ignorance." He swallowed. "Victor intended to purchase my share of the family company. He needed it for a larger acquisition. Expansion, he called it. He made the offer sound generous, but it wasn't. It was pressure. He cornered me. He threatened to expose debts I owed, foolish debts from earlier years." Poirot gently prompted, "And if he exposed these?" Daniel's voice cracked. "My reputation would be ruined. I'd lose the little position I still hold. Margaret would be forced to restructure the estate. It would all collapse." "Did your sister know of this?" Poirot asked. "No," he whispered. "I didn't tell her. She has enough burdens." His eyes filled with tears. "Victor knew exactly where to strike. He used my past, my failures, against me." Hastings said softly, "He sounds a hard man." Daniel nodded sharply. "Hard and dangerous, but murder. I swear, Poirot, I never wished him dead." Poirot studied him carefully. Daniel's distress seemed real, his anxiety not manufactured. "You have been honest," Poirot said finally. "Remain so." Daniel stepped back, clearly relieved, yet still shaken. Poirot did not immediately speak again. Instead, he looked across the ballroom, letting his keen gaze sweep over the guests' haunted faces. Margaret Whitfield, grief-stricken, yet holding on to dignity as though it were her final refuge. Caroline Brooks, resentful yet principled, her past conflict with Hale a sharp blade, though not necessarily used. Daniel Whitfield, cornered, pressured, fearful, and harboring regrets heavy as winter's stone. And yet Poirot sensed the picture was still incomplete. Inspector Reed approached. "Well, what do you think, Poirot? 3 strong motives already, and no shortage of opportunity." Poirot gave a small smile, one that did not reach his eyes. "Inspector, a motive alone does not place a string in the killer's hand. Yet tonight we gather motives as easily as decorations fallen from a tree. They are plentiful." Reed frowned. "But which motive matters most?" Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "That, Inspector, is the delicate question, and the answer, like the truth, must be assembled with care. For motives, like ornaments, may glitter, but only one will hang upon the branch that leads directly to murder." He turned slowly, eyes examining the arch once more. The broken string, the crushed mistletoe, and the faces illuminated by candlelight. "This crime," Poirot murmured, "is wrapped in ribbon, but beneath the ribbon is something far less festive." Hastings shivered. "You mean the killer is among them?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, Hastings, and before the next hour strikes, we shall begin to untangle the ribbon and reveal the hand that tied the knot." And as the ballroom fell into a tense hush, the Christmas decorations glimmered coldly, mocking in their cheer. Concealing a truth Poirot was now determined to unwrap. Chapter 5a. A walk through the snow. The storm that had raged earlier in the afternoon had long since gentled, leaving Briarstone Hall wrapped in a hush of falling snow. Beyond the illuminated windows of the ballroom, where guests huddled in anxious clusters and murmured questions, traveled like uneasy spirits, a quieter world waited, blanketed in white. The air was crisp, the kind that sharpened the senses, and Poirot welcomed the cold as one welcomes clarity. "Hastings," Poirot said softly, fastening the buttons of his coat, "a crime committed indoors often leaves its truest traces outdoors. We must walk." Hastings pulled on his gloves, shivering slightly. "Out here, in this weather, but surely the murderer would not have risked going outside." Poirot smiled gently. "Risk, my friend, is a relative thing. And snow, it records what men would rather forget." They stepped out through a rear service door, boots crunching softly on the pristine surface. The garden behind the ballroom stretched out in sweeping terraces, dotted with frozen fountains and iron benches dusted in winter lace. Lanterns flickered faintly along the pathways, their light swallowed almost immediately by the falling snow. Poirot paused, scanning the scene with deliberate care. "There," he murmured, pointing with the tip of his cane. "You see, a set of footprints, clear, deliberate, led away from the ballroom wall, curving toward a small side door half, hidden beneath a canopy of evergreen boughs. This entrance, Poirot knew, connected directly to a narrow passage behind the mistletoe arch." Hastings leaned down, examining the impressions. "One person, I think, and rather hurried." Poirot knelt with surprising grace, gloved fingers hovering just above the prints. "Note how the steps deepen at irregular intervals." Our visitor stopped more than once, perhaps to glance behind, perhaps to ensure no one followed. He rose. "These prints were made recently, within an hour at most. The snowfall since then has not yet filled them." Hastings frowned. "But who would come out here in the middle of the gala?" Poirot did not answer immediately. He moved along the line of prints, following them to the shrubs bordering the path. The evergreens here were thick and tall, providing both shelter and concealment. Beneath their branches, the snow had accumulated unevenly, and something bright glinted faintly from within. Poirot bent down and carefully lifted a scrap of fabric from the snow, a torn piece of bright red ribbon. Hastings's eyes widened. "The same ribbon they used to decorate the mistletoe arch. Exactement. Forgive me." Poirot corrected himself. "Precisely." He held the ribbon to the lantern's glow. It was crisp, edged, torn rather than cut, and still tied in a loose, half-formed knot, meaning it had once belonged to a longer strand. "This ribbon," Poirot said, "did not fall by chance. It was torn away in haste, perhaps, when our culprit adjusted the decorations to conceal the firing mechanism." "So someone came out here to prepare the trap?" Hastings asked. "Not prepare," Poirot replied. "Observe, adjust, perhaps even pull the string taut from the outside before threading it back into the ballroom." Hastings looked puzzled. But why do such a thing out here? Wouldn't the killer want to remain inside unnoticed? Poirot tapped the ribbon lightly with his fingertip. "Sometimes, my friend, one step outside the room provides the privacy one needs. A mechanism like the one in the arch cannot be arranged in a crowded ballroom, not without attracting unwanted notice." He moved farther along the shrubs, eyes narrowing. "And look here." Hastings followed, blinking at a shallow depression in the snow beside the evergreen hedge. It was not the shape of a footprint, nor a fallen branch. It was the shape of a knee. "Someone knelt here," Hastings said in surprise. "What for?" Poirot crouched to inspect the indentation more closely. "To reach beneath the arch from outside the window. See? This spot aligns perfectly with the lower pane." He pressed lightly against the sill, watching the shadow of the mistletoe arch inside. The frame gave the slightest answering tremor, the decorations swaying almost imperceptibly. "You observe, Hastings. The arch is not fixed as firmly as one would expect. A subtle adjustment here could alter its balance so that it settles into place only when a person stands directly beneath it." The ballroom's tall windows overlooked this section of garden. One of them, left unlatched for ventilation during the crowded gala, opened directly toward the mistletoe arch inside. Poirot straightened. "From here, our murderer could adjust the mechanism, slip the ribbon into place, or resecure the trigger string, all without stepping into the ballroom where sharp eyes might observe them." Hastings considered this. Then they must have known this window was unlatched. "Just so," Poirot said, "meaning our culprit had familiarity with the house, or at least observed its preparation carefully." He stepped back, surveying the scene as a whole, the footprints, the torn ribbon, the kneeling indentation together. They formed a silent narrative. "A clandestine visit," Poirot murmured. "A moment alone, a careful adjustment of a very deadly device." Hastings breathed out slowly. So the killer slipped outside, knelt there to reach through the window, made some adjustment to the arch, and then returned inside as though nothing had happened. Poirot nodded, tapping his cane lightly on the snow. Yes, and consider one more detail. Hastings, the footprints do not return. They lead only from the ballroom, not back to it. Hastings blinked. Then where did the murderer go? Poirot smiled faintly. Into the hall by another entrance, perhaps through the service corridor, perhaps around to the front. But I assure you, our killer did not remain in the snow longer than necessary. He held up the torn ribbon. This, my friend, is our first true clue that links the crime scene to someone's deliberate, secret action. Hastings stared at it uneasily. Poirot, do you believe the killer is someone Margaret knows well, someone the household trusts? Poirot's eyes twinkled, not with amusement, but with certainty. Hastings, it is nearly always so. Murder, like mischief, prefers familiar ground. He tucked the ribbon safely into his coat pocket. Let us return. The snow has told us part of the story. Now we must discover whose hands guided the ribbon and who knelt in the cold to arrange a death beneath the mistletoe. As they made their way back toward the faint glow of the ballroom windows, the falling snow continued to erase the prints behind them, just as the murderer had hoped. But Poirot, satisfied with what he had learned, knew that erasure came too late. For once the snow had spoken, he would not forget a single step. Chapter 6. Fey Secrets. In Victor Hale's room, the upper corridor of Briarstone Hall was unusually quiet as Poirot and Hastings approached Victor Hale's guest room. The bustle of the ballroom felt a world away. Here, the shadows were longer, the silence heavier. A constable stood guard at the door and stepped aside, the moment he recognized Poirot. Inside, the atmosphere was starkly different from the elegant room Margaret Whitfield had prepared for her guests. Disorder reigned. The bed covers were rumpled, drawers hung partially open, and most striking of all, the locked briefcase lay on the floor, its metal clasp snapped clean through. Good heavens, Hastings murmured. Summoner broke into it. Poirot approached the battered briefcase with slow, deliberate steps. He knelt, fingers hovering just above the jagged edge of the broken lock. This was not the work of a patient hand, he said quietly. It was done with force and haste. He stood and moved to the desk. Papers lay scattered across its polished surface like fallen leaves after a storm. Contracts, maps, correspondence, and several sheets marked with Hale's distinctive, sharp handwriting. A lamp had been knocked aside, casting slanted light across the disarray. Poirot picked up one document carefully. Regard, Hastings, an unsigned contract. Hastings read over his shoulder. A merger between the Hale Group and Whitfield Enterprises? Poirot nodded. More than a merger, mon ami, though I restrain myself. It is an acquisition in all but name. Should Margaret and Daniel sign this contract, Hale would gain complete control of the Whitfield estate. Hastings frowned, but Margaret said he wanted her to sell only a woodland tract. Poirot tapped the contract lightly. This is larger in ambition. Victor Hale had a grander scheme, control of the estate's business, its land, its holdings, its legacy. Such power, Hastings, is a potent motive, not only for pressure, but for desperation. Beside the contract sat a fountain pen, its cap missing. A puddle of blue ink had formed beneath it, staining a second sheet of paper. Though most of that sheet had been ripped away, leaving only the corner behind, Poirot leaned closer, examining the torn fibers. This tear, he murmured, was made with great speed. Someone removed the letter abruptly, perhaps in panic, perhaps in anger. Hastings asked, "Do you think Hale wrote something incriminating?" Poirot stared at the remaining fragment. "Number, I think the missing letter was not Hale's writing at all. Observe the ink blot. The pen leaked when it was knocked aside. The torn paper corner has no ink on its edge. It did not come from beneath the pen." Hastings blinked. "So someone else wrote it?" Poirot nodded. "Precisely. Someone wrote a letter in this room. Today or tonight someone left it here, and someone, perhaps the same person, returned to take it back. He turned the scrap over between finger and thumb. The hand that penned it, what little one can see of the spacing, is neat but hesitant. Not a man accustomed to signing his will upon the world, Hastings, but one accustomed to apologizing for it. Hastings paced thoughtfully. This room has become a battlefield. Someone broke in, stole something, and confronted Hale, all before he was killed. Poirot began examining the scattered papers, his eyes catching patterns others would overlook. "Look here," he said, lifting a document half hidden beneath the ink. Splattered sheet. It was a ledger page, names, sums, and notes scribbled in the margins. "Hale kept records," Hastings said. "Hale kept leverage," Poirot corrected. "Debts owed to him, shares held over others. Each note here is a portrait of pressure." He traced one line with his fingertip: Daniel Whitfield, Fay outstanding repayment. Terms renegotiated pending signature. Hastings exhaled. "Daniel told us Hale cornered him. This proves it." Poirot placed the ledger gently aside. "And look, Margaret Whitfield's name appears as well." Hastings stared. He held influence over both siblings. He was tightening his grip. Poirot straightened slowly. "This, Hastings, is the nest of the viper. It shows us Hale's ambitions, and those who might wish to stop him." He crossed to the window, noticing faint scratches on the sill. "Hastings," Poirot said softly, "someone left this room in distress. Someone climbed out, or leaned out, perhaps to discard something. But more importantly, someone was here with Hale tonight." Hastings looked startled. "You mean before he was killed beneath the arch?" Poirot nodded. "Yes. This room speaks of confrontation, rage, fear, the briefcase, broken open, the ink, spilled in struggle, the torn letter, removed in haste, and Hale's expression in those last seconds. Did you note it? Not only pain, but surprise, as though his end came from an unexpected hand." Hastings swallowed. "Then someone threatened him tonight." Poirot's eyes glinted with sharp comprehension. "Threatened or attempted blackmail?" Hastings frowned. "Blackmail? Who would dare blackmail Victor Hale? He was the one who held all the cards." Poirot folded his arms behind his back. Perhaps someone wished finally to turn the tables. Perhaps the missing letter was a demand, a confession, a plea, and perhaps Hale reacted with fury or with promises of ruin. He swept a hand toward the disarray before them. "What you see here is a scene of desperation. Hastings, and desperation makes people bold." Hastings hesitated. "Poirot, could this person be the murderer? Could they have returned later, determined to silence Hale forever?" Poirot looked thoughtfully toward the door. "It is possible," he said. "Very possible, for blackmailers are often murderers, and the blackmailed all too often the murdered." He examined the room one last time. "But the truth, my friend, is scattered across these papers. Hale's secrets are abundant, and secrets, like poison, leave traces if one knows where to search." Poirot pocketed nothing. He needed no physical souvenir. What mattered was pattern, motive, pressure. The pieces were beginning to align. He stepped toward the door. "Come, Hastings, let us return to the ballroom. There are still those who have not told us the full truth, and one among them who fears we will discover it." As they departed, the shadows in Victor Hale's room seemed to deepen, as though acknowledging that its secrets were at last coming into view, but not yet fully revealed. Chapter 7, Fay the journalist's notes. The drawing room had been temporarily repurposed into a quieter space, where Poirot could speak to individuals without the mounting panic of the ballroom. The lamps were dimmed to calm the frayed nerves of those waiting to be questioned, but the subdued light only emphasized the shadows lengthening along the walls. Hastings stood beside the mantel, keeping a polite distance while Poirot motioned Caroline Brooks forward. Caroline carried her notebook clasped to her chest as though it were both shield and sword. Her earlier composure had not vanished, but it had grown more brittle. A woman who lived by her pen rarely surrendered it willingly. "Miss Brooks," Poirot said gently, You hinted earlier that your reporting once uncovered unsavory truths about Monsieur Hale. Might I request the privilege of reading your notes for this evening? Caroline hesitated, her jaw tightening for a moment. These notes contained confidential leads, Mr. Poirot. Information entrusted to me as a journalist. Poirot inclined his head sympathetically. I understand the sanctity of professional confidence, and yet a murder has been committed. Lives are in balance, yours as well, mademoiselle. The manner of Hale's death was subtle, ingenious. Such crimes cast suspicion very broadly indeed. Her eyes flickered, defensiveness, then resignation. You think I could have done it? I think, Poirot said mildly, that clarity will protect the innocent. A beat passed. Then, with a long breath, Caroline opened her notebook and handed it to him. Only you, she warned quietly, and nothing leaves the room. The pages were filled with tight, slanted handwriting, notes, dates, arrows, little stars marking important details. Poirot skimmed with deft precision. Ah, he murmured, Victor Hale, property disputes, offshore accounts, misappropriated charity funds. Caroline looked away. He was a fraud in the making, Mr. Poirot. The public knew only his philanthropy, not the strings he pulled behind the scenes. Poirot turned another page. Here, the handwriting changed, more hurried. Meeting tonight. Source signs only W. claims proof of misconduct. Says, after the toast, it ends for him. Must confront Hale after toast. Poirot tapped the entry lightly. This meeting. Did it occur? Caroline shook her head. Number the source never appeared, or perhaps they lost their nerve. I waited in the corridor outside the library at 9:30. Exactly as instructed, no one came. And you believe the source intended to expose Hale? I do. They promised documents. Something damning. Enough to topple him. Poirot closed the notebook. And what would you have done with such information? Caroline straightened. Published it. Nothing more. Exposing corruption is my work, not poisoning men in crowded ballrooms. Her words rang sincere, but Poirot watched closely, noting how her hands, clasped tightly together, shifted within her gloves. Miss Brooks, Poirot said quietly. Your gloves. May I see them? Caroline blinked. My gloves. Poirot gestured gently. Merely hold them toward the light. She complied reluctantly, lifting her hands. Poirot leaned in, studying the fingertips and palms. Hastings drew in a breath. Is that green dust? Caroline looked startled. She lifted her gloved hands closer, noticing the faint green smudges for the first time. Oh, that must be from the garlands, she said hastily. When Victor fell, people pushed forward, and I stumbled. I grabbed the arch to steady myself. Poirot said nothing at first. He removed a handkerchief and lightly pressed it to one of the smudges. When he withdrew it, the cloth bore a faint stain. Mistletoe, Poirot said softly, crushed, fresh. Caroline's eyes widened. Are you implying I? Poirot raised a calming hand. I imply nothing without proof, but consider. This residue suggests you touched the arch recently, perhaps immediately before or after the dart was fired. Caroline's voice sharpened. Victor collapsed beneath the arch. Everyone was jostling. I reached out instinctively. It doesn't mean I tampered with anything. Poirot watched her a moment longer. He saw no guile in her expression, yet sincerity alone could not erase suspicion. And, he added gently, the notebook reveals motive. Hale sought to destroy your career once. If he discovered your source or the story you intended to publish tonight, Caroline's jaw clenched. He did. That's why the meeting never happened. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Explain. She swallowed. I saw him, Victor, just after 8. He was speaking in the corridor with Daniel Whitfield. His voice carried. He said he knew someone planned to smear him tonight, and that he would take care of it. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. And how did that make you feel? Poirot asked. Caroline's shoulders sagged, angry, terrified, but not murderous. Poirot closed the notebook and returned it to her gently. Your notes are thorough, honest. They reveal much about Hale, but little about your heart. Caroline inhaled sharply, blinking away emotion. Poirot watched her carefully, her posture, her defiance, the faint tremor in her fingers. "Hastings," Poirot said quietly once she stepped aside. "What do you think?" Hastings frowned. "She has a motive, and the mistletoe on her gloves." Poirot nodded. "Oui, but she is not the only one who handled the arch tonight, nor the only one who wished to unmask Victor Hale." He tucked his hands behind his back. "The clues gather Hastings a secret meeting that never occurred. A missing letter from Hale's room. A mechanism fired at precisely the right moment, and mistletoe crushed by more than one hand." Hastings swallowed. "Poirot, do you suspect Caroline?" Poirot's moustache lifted slightly. "I suspect, my friend, that someone seeks to wrap guilt around her as neatly as ribbon around a gift." He looked once more at her gloves, her notebook, the tension in her stance. "But I also suspect she is not the killer." Hastings sighed in relief. Poirot stepped toward the window, where snow drifted against the glass. "Come," he said softly. "It is time we examine which motives are real, and which are only ornament. The true killer hides not in shadows, but in choices." He turned back toward the guests. And tonight, that choice was murder. Chapter 8. Faye Daniel's confession and Margaret's fear. The storm outside was beginning to strengthen again, its wind pushing faint flurries of snow against the tall windows of Briarstone Hall. Inside, however, the true turbulence was human. The drawing-room, stately, warm and shuttered from the cold, had become a crucible of confession. Inspector Reed stood at the center of the room, like a stern conductor orchestrating a discordant ensemble. Daniel Whitfield sat on a fainting couch near the fire, shoulders hunched, fingers locked together so tightly, the knuckles had drained of color. His eyes were red, rimmed. He had the look of a man afraid not just of the truth, but of himself. Poirot stepped toward him with quiet gravity. "Mr. Whitfield," Poirot said, "earlier you spoke of pressure, of debts of coercion, but now, if you please, we must speak of your movements tonight." Daniel swallowed hard. I know. I knew this moment would come." He lifted trembling hands to his face, drawing in a ragged breath before speaking. "I followed him," Daniel said. "I followed Victor Hale just after 9 o'clock. Murmurs rippled through the room. Margaret made a small choking sound. "It was my letter," he blurted suddenly. "The one you found the torn corner of in his room, Mr. Poirot. I was Caroline's anonymous source. I wrote to her. Told her I had proof of how Victor was using our company, how he meant to bleed it dry. I slipped the letter into his briefcase, thinking that if he knew I was ready to expose him, he might be forced to bargain." He gave a strangled laugh. "But I lost my nerve. I saw him heading toward the east corridor, the one that leads to the library. I'd been drinking a little. I admit that, but not enough to forget everything. I confronted him there instead." Inspector Reed stepped forward. "What did you confront him with?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "I told him to withdraw the merger papers. Told him I wouldn't sign, no matter how much he threatened. I thought, God help me, I thought that if I just stood up to him once, he'd stop." "And did he?" Poirot asked gently. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. "Number, he mocked me, said I was weak, said I was already ruined, and that my signature was only a matter of time." He closed his eyes, the memory visibly cutting him. "And then," Poirot prompted softly, "and then he walked away." Daniel's voice broke. "He left unharmed. He left furious, but very much alive." Reed narrowed his eyes. "And you're certain you did not go near the Mistletoe arch after that?" Daniel shook his head vehemently. "Number, I swear on what little honor I have left. I didn't go there. I stayed in the library corridor for several minutes, trying to gather myself. I couldn't face the ballroom. I didn't want Margaret to know I'd confronted him." Margaret let out a soft, wounded breath. Her eyes shimmered with pain. Pain not of guilt, but of a sister hearing her brother's shame laid bare. Poirot watched the siblings silently for a moment, then stepped closer to Margaret. "Miss Whitfield," he said gently, "there is something you too must explain." Margaret looked up, startled. But I have already told you. Yes, I feared Victor might cause trouble tonight. I feared he might make an announcement about selling our land. But I never touched that arch, Mr. Poirot. Never. Poirot held her gaze, sympathetic yet unyielding. Fear can make people conceal more than intentions, he said. It can make them conceal truths. Margaret's lips trembled. What more do you want me to say? Poirot stepped back slightly, giving her space. Let us begin with what you did admit, he said. You knew of Victor's threats to withdraw funding. You knew he wished to coerce your family into selling the land. Yes, Margaret whispered. I knew, and you feared tonight would be the moment he chose to reveal it to the guests, to embarrass you publicly. Her chin dipped. Yes, Poirot nodded. Now we consider one more detail, a detail small enough to escape most eyes. He gestured toward her gown. Your sash, Miss Whitfield. It is missing a length of ribbon. Margaret blinked, then looked down instinctively. She had worn a sash of deep red satin earlier, a festive accessory to her green velvet gown. But now, one edge was frayed, the ribbon shorter than it had been, missing. She whispered, I didn't notice. Poirot spoke quietly. I found a strip of red ribbon in the garden, torn as though ripped away in haste. The same color, the same weave. Margaret went pale. Caroline Brooks murmured, Margaret, did you go outside? Daniel turned to his sister, his expression a mixture of confusion and dread. Margaret, is this, did you? Margaret lifted a trembling hand. No, I didn't go outside. I didn't touch the arch. Poirot watched her carefully. Her distress was genuine. Her eyes wide with terror, her breath shallow, her hands trembling, but distress could itself be a cloak, whether of innocence or guilt. Miss Whitfield, Poirot said softly, tell me, did you adjust your sash earlier tonight? Did anyone else touch it? Margaret hesitated. But only briefly. Yes, she whispered. Victor did. The room froze. Daniel stiffened. Reed's brows shot upward. Hastings let out a low gasp. Caroline scribbled furiously in her notebook. Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper. Victor Hale touched your sash. Yes, Margaret said breathlessly. He cornered me at the start of the gala, before the guests all arrived. He pulled at the ribbon on my sash as he spoke, as if he owned me, as if he owned everything. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And what did he say? Her face crumpled. He said he would make an announcement tonight that would change everything, that we should be ready. And then he tugged at my sash. She touched the frayed edge. It must have torn then. Poirot folded his hands, thinking. So, he said slowly, the torn ribbon near the arch may not have belonged to you after all. It may have come from someone who used identical decorations, or from the arch itself. Inspector Reed let out a breath he had been holding. Hastings relaxed only slightly. Poirot, however, remained still, his gaze shifting between Margaret and Daniel, as though weighing two sides of the same coin. He knew Margaret was not lying. Her fear was honest, her distress not feigned. And yet, Miss Whitfield, Poirot said gently, you feared tonight would end in ruin if Victor had his way. Margaret nodded miserably. I did, but I swear, I did not kill him. Daniel reached for her hand, his voice breaking. I believe you, Margaret. Poirot watched the gesture. The siblings finally united in fear where before they had been fractured by pride and secrecy. He stepped back and turned to Hastings. You see, Hastings, Poirot murmured, fear and desperation walk hand in hand, but only one becomes a murderer. Hastings swallowed. Poirot, do you think either of them? Poirot's eyes flashed, bright with understanding, but not yet revealing. No, he said softly. They are both lying in pieces, but not in guilt. He turned back to Inspector Reed. We move forward, Inspector. The threads tighten, the motives multiply, and yet there is still one ribbon we have not tugged. Poirot looked toward the doorway, where the ballroom's distant murmur echoed faintly. One person watched all of this unfold with great interest. One person who stands at the center of every motive and every secret. He tapped his cane lightly. It is time, Hastings. Time to see who else stood beneath the mistletoe before the scream. Chapter 9. Faye, the drawing room revelation. The storm outside Briarstone Hall had grown into a full and furious gale, rattling the shutters and sweeping curls of frozen snow against the tall windows. Inside the drawing room, however, a fire hissed and crackled in the hearth, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill of fear that clung to every guest assembled. Inspector Reed stood near the doorway, arms crossed, ready to prevent anyone from leaving. Hastings hovered at Poirot's shoulder, equal parts anxious and astonished. Caroline Brooks, Daniel Whitfield, and Margaret Whitfield sat or stood at varying distances from the firelight, each wearing expressions shaped by the night's shocks. Every eye in the room was fixed upon Hercule Poirot. Poirot stood near the mantel, hands neatly folded, eyes bright as candle flames reflected in their depths. He began to speak with the quiet gravity of a man assembling the final pieces of a hidden picture. "My friends," Poirot said, "we come now to the truth, not wrapped in ribbons or disguised beneath festive garlands, but plain, if unpleasant, to see." He paced a slow circle around the drawing room, allowing his gaze to linger on each person in turn. "You have all given your confessions, your fears and your motives, and yet none of these alone made you a murderer." Daniel swallowed, wringing his hands. Caroline stiffened. Margaret stared at the fire, pale but attentive. Poirot continued, "Let us begin with the dart. Many believed it fired at random, that the killer may have stood close by and released the mechanism with a simple tug on the string. But this is, in fact, not the full truth." Inspector Reed frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot turned toward him. "For the mechanism to fire the dart with the correct force, two things were needed. First, the pulling of the string to release the latch. Second, the weight of the mistletoe arch shifting, ever so slightly, when someone stepped beneath it." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Hastings stared. "You mean it depended on someone's weight?" Poirot nodded. "Exactment." "Ah, forgive me, precisely. The trap was designed so that the weight of the arch shifted just enough to align the barrel. Without a person beneath it, the dart would not strike its target. Thus, the killer did not merely pull a string." He paused, then spoke with deliberate clarity. "They waited for Victor Hale to step under the mistletoe." Caroline murmured. "So it had to be someone who knew his habits." "Indeed," Poirot said. "Mr. Hale enjoyed standing in places of attention, making toasts, greeting donors, positioning himself under the mistletoe like a king at court. Only someone familiar with him, his patterns, his preferences, could ensure he would be in exactly the right place." His gaze slid to Caroline. "Miss Brooks, you brushed against the mistletoe garlands earlier. But that residue was from attempting to help when Hale fell. You did not tamper with it, and you did not assemble the device." Caroline exhaled sharply, relief visible in her shoulders. Poirot then turned to Daniel. "Mr. Whitfield, your anger tonight was real. Your confrontation with Hale left you broken with regret, but you lacked the technical knowledge to construct such a mechanism. I believe you could barely face him again after that argument, let alone execute an assassination with mechanical finesse." Daniel closed his eyes, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. Poirot's voice softened. "You are troubled, yes, but you are not a murderer." Margaret trembled visibly, her fingers tightening around the arm of her chair. Poirot stepped toward her with great gentleness, yet unmistakable purpose. "And so we come," Poirot said quietly, "to the one person who knew the arch intimately, who oversaw the decorations, who had both opportunity and motive, and whose missing ribbon I found outside the garden door." Margaret flinched. Inspector Reed straightened. "Miss Whitfield." Margaret stood abruptly, shaking her head, her voice trembling. No, Mr. Poirot. You misunderstand, I told you. Victor pulled at my sash earlier. He tore it himself. Poirot tilted his head slightly. Yes, that is what you said. And indeed, part of your sash was torn, but only part. He removed from his pocket the piece of red satin ribbon he had found in the snow garden. And this, Miss Whitfield, did not come from your sash. Margaret staggered. What? Poirot spread the ribbon in his hand. Your sash is torn at the end. This ribbon was torn from the middle of a strip, pulled away with great force, and this satin is not tailored cloth of a gown, but the coarse ribbon used for the mistletoe arch. Margaret paled further. Poirot's voice gentled. You were seen near the arch before the toast. You positioned yourself as hostess, guiding guests, smiling, moving people into place. You ensured Hale would stand exactly where the trap needed him. Margaret's lips trembled. I didn't, Poirot, please. I didn't kill Victor. Poirot stepped closer, eyes compassionate but unwavering. You feared, Miss Whitfield, that Hale's announcement tonight would ruin everything, that he would reveal your debts, your family's instability, perhaps even force a sale that would disgrace your name. Margaret shook her head violently. I feared it, yes. But fear alone does not make a murderer. No, Poirot said gently. It does not. He paused, then continued. But love does, when love is twisted with desperation. Margaret froze. Daniel whispered. Margaret? Poirot's voice softened even further. You planned everything, Miss Whitfield. You did not intend to kill him in cold blood. You intended to frighten him, just enough to make him withdraw his threats. The dart was not meant to hit him at the heart. You aimed for the shoulder. Margaret collapsed into her chair, trembling. Poirot continued. You assumed the poison would only cause pain, enough to humble him. Enough to stop him. You did not know how potent it truly was. The mechanism was clumsy, the alignment imperfect, but when Hale stepped beneath the arch at precisely the wrong angle, he paused. The dart struck deeper than you intended. A sob broke from Margaret's lips. Caroline whispered, Dear God. Daniel sank into a chair, staring at his sister in stunned silence. Inspector Reed stepped forward. Miss Whitfield, are you confessing? Margaret covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook, not with denial, but with the unbearable weight of truth. I only wanted to save my family, she cried. I wanted to stop Victor before he destroyed everything we had left. I didn't want him to die. Poirot, you must believe me. I didn't want him to die. Poirot placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I believe you, Miss Whitfield, but intent does not erase consequence. Margaret sobbed harder, collapsing into herself. Inspector Reed signaled the constables. Margaret Whitfield, you are to be taken into custody. You will have the chance to explain in full. She did not resist as she was led away. Daniel buried his face in his hands. Hastings whispered to Poirot, How did you know? Poirot watched somberly as the last traces of the hostess's composure vanished through the doorway. My friend, he murmured, in a house full of ribbon and decoration, it is always the missing piece that matters most. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the truth settled over Briarstone Hall like a heavy snowfall, quiet, final, and inescapably cold. Chapter 10. Fay beneath the mistletoe shadow. The storm had reached its full, unrelenting force by the time Margaret Whitfield was brought into the small study adjacent to the drawing-room. Snow whipped against the window panes like a relentless hand demanding entry. The fire flickered uncertainly, casting trembling shadows across the walls, shadows that mirrored the trembling of Margaret's own hands. Inspector Reed stood at a respectful distance, allowing Poirot the chance to speak with her first. Hastings watched in somber silence. Caroline and Daniel hovered nearby, their expressions taut with grief and disbelief. Margaret sat on a low upholstered chair, her eyes red, her breath shallow. The poise she had displayed throughout the gala had crumbled completely, leaving behind only a woman exhausted by secrets. Poirot took a seat opposite her, folding his hands with quiet gentleness. Miss Whitfield, he said softly, we must understand everything, clearly and completely, not for the sake of blame alone, but for truth and for peace. Margaret lifted her eyes, pained, fearful, yet determined to speak at last. "I will tell you," she whispered. "I will tell you everything." She swallowed hard, gathering the shards of courage she had left. "I never meant to kill Victor Hale." Poirot inclined his head. "I believe that, but you must explain what you did intend." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. When she spoke again, her voice trembled like a candle flame in a draught. "I wanted to frighten him." She rubbed her palms together, as if trying to erase the memory imprinted upon them. "You must understand. Victor was going to announce the merger tonight, publicly before the press. Before my friends, before the donors who trusted me. He meant to expose my debts, Daniel's failings. He wanted to shame us both into submission." Daniel flinched, guilt and anguish warring on his face. Margaret continued, tears streaking her cheeks. "I could not let him. Briarstone Hall, the charity, everything my parents built. They were his bargaining chips, and he enjoyed it. He enjoyed watching us twist." Poirot nodded slowly. "So you resorted to a desperate measure." Margaret covered her face with her hands. "I found the little mechanism in the attic. My father once used it to shoot paper darts during holiday games when we were children. I remembered it, and I thought, if I could frighten Victor, give him a small sting, show him he was not invincible, perhaps he would relent." She shuddered. "The poison? I did not even think of it as such. There's an old locked cupboard in the gun room. The gamekeeper used to keep a bottle there to lace bait for foxes that worried the hens. I still had the key. I told myself a drop would only make Victor ill, shake him, force him to reconsider. I never imagined it would act so quickly, or so absolutely." Poirot spoke gently, though his eyes remained sharp. "You placed the mechanism inside the mistletoe arch." "Yes, I did it hours before the gala. I hid it inside the garland so no one would notice. Then I threaded a ribbon through the trigger string. I planned to stand near the arch and tug it only when Victor wasn't directly beneath it. Only to scare him, to make him jump. Nothing more." Caroline let out a quiet, horrified breath. "So it was sabotage, but not murder." Margaret nodded, sobbing softly. Poirot waited patiently for her to continue. "When Victor left the ballroom earlier," Margaret said, "I followed him to the side corridor. I wanted to confront him, to beg him to reconsider his announcement, but he brushed me aside. He said he would destroy us publicly, and that there was nothing I could do to stop him." Her shoulders shook violently. "So I went out to the garden door. From there I could tug the ribbon without being seen. I waited until I heard Margaret calling the guests to gather. I wanted the moment dramatic, but safe. I meant only to humiliate him, never to harm him." Poirot breathed out softly. "But something went wrong." Margaret nodded, trembling. "I tugged the ribbon too hard, or perhaps the cold had weakened the string. I do not know, but it snapped earlier than I intended." Her voice broke. The dart fired, and Victor stepped beneath the mistletoe at that exact moment. A sob tore from her throat. Daniel moved forward instinctively, but Reed held him back with a firm gesture. Margaret whispered, "It was an accident, Poirot, a terrible accident born of pride, anger, and fear. I swear I never meant to kill him." Poirot leaned forward, his expression filled with grave compassion. "I believe you, Miss Whitfield, every word." Inspector Reed stepped forward now, his voice steady but not unkind. "Margaret Whitfield, you will need to answer for what happened, but the law will consider your intention and the lack of malice." Margaret nodded weakly, her eyes hollow but accepting. As Reed escorted her toward the doorway, Margaret paused. She turned back to Poirot. "Do you think," she whispered, "my parents would have forgiven me?" Poirot met her gaze gently. "I think," he said, "that they would have grieved for your despair and prayed that you would learn from it. But forgiveness, that Miss Whitfield, is always possible." Margaret gave a final shuddering breath and allowed herself to be led away. Silence settled over the study, heavy, mournful, inevitable, Hastings exhaled shakily. A tragedy, Poirot. A senseless, dreadful tragedy. Poirot walked to the window, where the storm winds howled and snow blurred the world into white. Yes, Hastings, he said quietly, a tragedy born of fear and pride, and one miscalculated moment beneath the mistletoe. He placed a hand gently on the cold pane of glass. The mistletoe, symbol of joy, of unity, of affection. But tonight, it became the stage for folly and desperation. A reminder that even the merriest traditions can cast long shadows when the human heart is troubled. Hastings joined him at the window. At least the truth is known. Poirot nodded. Yes, and truth, mon ami. Truth must always be known, even when it brings no joy. The storm raged on. Briarstone Hall stood silent, and beneath the mistletoe's shadow, the echoes of a single fatal moment lingered, mingling with the winter wind as Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings turned away, carrying with them the knowledge that sometimes the gravest tragedies arise not from evil intentions, but from the fragile, faltering choices of a desperate heart